Okay, colleagues, welcome back, and we are ready to move on with the next panel, which is the higher education panel. Our title, Higher Education, What It Can and Cannot Do, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you our distinguished panel. Starting to my immediate right is Sharon Fechter, who is Professor of Spanish and Chair of the Department of World Languages and Philosophy at Montgomery College. She's also President-elect of the American Association of Teachers of Spanish and Portuguese. She's going to open up today with helping us bridge from K-12 to community colleges and from there to higher ed. Following Sharon's presentation, I will invite Rosemary Fell. I'm very pleased Rosemary is here today representing the Modern Language Association, which includes not only all modern language and classical language teachers, but also all teachers of English in the United States, and that's a community that very much needs to be in our field of vision as we discussed today. Following Rosemary, we will hear from Jacqueline Royster, who is the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts from Georgia Institute of Technology, where language and technology and engineering education have come to live in a very, very interesting and mutually productive environment. And finally, it's an honor to introduce Dr. Sam Eisen, who is the director of the flagship program at Delenzio, Department of Defense, and before that served in the U.S. Department of Education's International and Foreign Area Department, and before that at the Department of State. So Sam brings to us the sort of multiple perspectives of the leadership and flagship, of the kind of history that our programs have in the Department of Education, and of the important role that the State Department programs are doing as well. Sam himself is an area expert and a specialist in the field of Russian, PhD from Stanford, so he's here in multiple guises. As we start, I have both some maybe mundane things to share, but also some things I consider to be very lofty and important that I hope we can add to the discourse of this morning's excellent meetings and comments. On the more mundane side, there's the 8% factor. The data produced by the December 2010 MLA enrollment survey, that's how many students we believe are engaged in the formal study of foreign languages at Emeritus 2- and 4-year colleges. And that is a low number, to be sure. On a more positive note, the enrollment data from MLA and other surveys makes it clear that the diversity of undergraduate university offerings has grown, has expanded in some important ways. We have levels of enrollment today in the study and teaching of Arabic language and culture, in Chinese, in Japanese, that were absolutely unheard of even 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. So that enrollment is not necessarily part of a zero-sum game, but what appears to be some growth that is absolute. The range of second languages is growing. The models by which students are learning is changing. I think there is much innovation in the foreign language field today, as we heard in K-12 to be sure, but higher ed also has some important new approaches that I think are generating results. We heard a little bit about the Middlebury program this morning from Jane, and we're going to hear a bit more this afternoon about other innovative centers in the United States that are leading, as you read in the white paper, to the production, really for the first time in our history, of a regular, consistent flow of 3-level speakers, including speakers who have come up through the channels of StarTalk, of K-12 learning, of CLS, of undergraduate training, flagship, and so forth, and are emerging into the professions with 3-level language. I think we can argue that that proof of concept is out there. It's working across institutional types. These are facts. Whether they're known is another problem. But we have a kind of proof of concept today that we did not have a few years ago. The challenges are also obvious. To all of us sitting here, but I want to maybe start the conversation on a little different note, and that is to remind yourself, following what we heard from President Lowe this morning and from the Vice Chancellor for Research, Patrick O'Shea, and that is that the universities have, higher education has an extraordinarily high opinion of what it does. And to the extent that we can associate what we're doing with that high mission, we will gain a position of influence. We can show that we are essential to that higher education mission, but we need not talk in small and dismissible ways about our role in the in what universities are doing. Let me give you a definition. You heard one this morning, but let's hear another one now. Universities are I'm quoting Ben Waldowski's great Brain Race. If you haven't seen that, it's marvelous, about the international global flow and competition for brains, and universities are sort of the drivers of that. Universities, he writes, is a centerpiece of the global knowledge economy, of the continuous global flow of people, ideas, information, knowledge, technologies, products, and yes, financial capital too. It's sufficient to recall, and maybe most of us don't ever think about this, we certainly don't talk to parents about it, that last year alone, American research universities absorbed $267 billion in research money. If you wonder why we get the attention of the Vice Rector for Research, it's because what we do is critically central to that mission. It's not just for love of languages, right? Or because of a daughter or a son who's studying the language right now. This is big business, and the global economy is huge. And universities' role in globalization is central. We can pretend we don't play a role in that, but actually, if you think of what we do, it is absolutely central to that mission. The 20th, and I have one other favorite quote I wanted to share, cited recently by Tom Friedman in a New York Times editorial, where he talks about the strategic inputs of economic growth and innovation in the world. And he said, you know, in the 19th century, the primary strategic input for an industrial cluster was flowing water. If you had water, you could drive a mill, you could generate energy. In the 20th century, it was electricity and transportation. In the 21st century, it's human intellectual capital. That's the driver, and I would submit that is what we do. We're all about human intellectual capital, not just workforce development, but also the great human intellectual capital investment, which is going to determine who wins and who leads. Microsoft has said its most sought-after competence, this work for any global corporation today, is not computer science, actually. It's people with strong communications, interpersonal, and negotiating skills. Strategic perspective, people able to see the big picture, to look also and recognize the underlying forces, those forces that are often not articulated, that influence a system subtly. We're looking for creativity, the global corporation says. We're looking for critical thinking. Try to do that without multiple perspectives. We're looking for a deep understanding of global and cross-cultural communication. And finally, we're looking for intentional learners, people with enhanced executive function, people who understand how to manage their own learning. I hope this sounds familiar to you. This is exactly what we do. We prepare people for this economy. We unduly modest about our work. Sharon, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here, and I appreciate the invitation to participate in this panel. I do feel a little bit out of place, first of all, because community colleges often aren't invited to this table, so I appreciate that very much. And second of all, because I don't have a daughter to brag about. I do boys. I really don't get the girl thing. But I'll work through these challenges as best I can today. I do work at a community college, a very large community college in the area. We enroll about 60,000 students between credit and non-credit offerings. We have about 27,000 credit students, many of whom, the majority of whom, seek to transfer, and that's going to be a big part of what I'd like to talk about today. We offer, partially because of our size and location, 12 languages. So our world language offerings are very robust, and we are about to add Hindi, thanks to the National Endowment for the Humanities grant. That'll be coming next year. I just wanted to provide a little bit of context about this sector before I talk about languages in the sector and some of our challenges. The American Association of Community Colleges is a very good organization. It provides a lot of data. The most recent data shows that community colleges educate about 13 million students in the United States between credit and non-credit offerings. 45% of all undergraduates in the United States are studying at community colleges. 45% of all first-time freshmen are studying at community colleges. 42% of all Native American students, and that figure is down significantly from last year. 44% of all Asian Pacific Islander students begin at community colleges. 49% of all Black students are at community colleges, and 56% of all Hispanic students are studying as undergraduates at community colleges. This last statistic in particular has far-reaching implications for us, for our curricula, and for our transfer of students. In terms of the faculty degree attainment statistics that the AACC keeps, it isn't broken down by discipline, but it is by general disciplinary area. In the humanities, most are required to have a master's degree, and in some cases the PhD is preferred, and that is the case with our institution as well. Let's talk about languages at two-year colleges, and you can correct me if I get any of this wrong. But there was a pretty robust, I think, response from two-year colleges to the survey. We are actually very well represented in the undergraduate sector. So not out of all language enrollments, but what I'm going to talk about is out of undergraduate enrollments. Spanish is around about 60% of all our enrollments, but there are a lot of other languages represented and heavily represented. American Sign Language, for example, which we offer at our institution, is over 50% of all undergraduate enrollments are at community colleges. Spanish enrollments, around 40% of all undergraduates who are studying Spanish are studying it at community colleges. But the statistics, while not that dramatic for other languages and some of the less commonly taught languages, are pretty interesting as well. About 20% of all Arabic enrollments were at two-year colleges, 19% for Chinese, around 20% for French, and again, close to 60% for ASL. If we break down those figures, we have over 30% of our students who are studying languages as undergraduates doing so at two-year colleges. So those are the rough figures. But we face many, many challenges. Some which are currently specific to the sector, and some which will very shortly spill over into the four-year sector. And I'm glad the folks from education are here, from the business sector as well, because I think this impacts all of us. One of the most important challenges that confronts us right away was mentioned in the white paper, and that is the challenge of articulation. And it's not just articulation in terms of transfer between the community college and the four-year school. It's vertical articulation, K-12 to community college to four-year school and beyond. If our link is missing, then we're not able to feed the majors. And if we're not able to feed the majors, then we have minors, et cetera, et cetera. When we offer this robust an offering of language, and certainly in the numbers that we have to talk to each other a little bit more than we're doing right now. I have a resource that I'm happy to share about transfer agreements in each of the states. I assure you, they differ widely, and they vary. They vary within the state. In my own state, in Maryland, my courses transfer differently to the University of Maryland at College Park than they do to UMBC, than they do to Towson, than they do to UMUC, et cetera. And we're only one of 17 community colleges, so you can imagine the confusion among students who say, it's not worth it. I'm not going to study languages while I'm here. Or I'm going to hurry up and get my languages out of the way and not continue beyond. This is a broken part of the system that we really need to fix. There is another challenge facing us, and that is the completion agenda. Is anybody aware of the completion agenda?
Yes.
It's really hitting community colleges very, very seriously. It's an initiative that supports the national goal to increase the number of students who complete degrees, credentials, certificates of some kind. It is a commitment to increase the completion rates by 50% over the next decade. What does that mean? That means a pathway to education. And right now, if you're in the state of Maryland, you are aware of Senate Bill 740, which right now impacts the community college and the K-12 sector more than the four-year school, but it will have a great impact on transfer. Right now, they are asking community colleges to give, and four-year schools, everybody, a pathway to graduation. What that pathway will mean, possibly, is a reduction in the richness of linguistic or language offerings that we see. It's a real possibility. So the pressure will be on Spanish and French, perhaps Chinese, and we won't necessarily have that written plan to hand to students the minute they walk on our campus. That, I think, is a challenge. Another challenge facing us, and will be facing everybody very soon, is the DREAM Act. I would say that a very high percentage, about 49–50% of all Hispanic students attending community colleges are impacted by this act. It has curricular implications as well, because most of the students, and in many of the states, students who are going to take advantage of the DREAM Act must begin at community colleges. Well, what does that say for us in terms of our curriculum? We need to have a much more robust and transferable set of offerings for heritage learners. When we do have them, they're slipshod nationwide. We're very clear about that in our American Association of Teachers of Spanish and Portuguese, and they don't uniformly transfer. Some states are doing a better job than others, but we're all going to be impacted by the pathways to success, or given lines within which students must remain in order to get that bachelor's degree in 4 years, the 2-year degree, the community college degree in 2 years. It will possibly limit our offerings. Even now, we are under siege in terms of what constitutes general education. Language, literature, culture, that's humanities. That's general education to my way of thinking. California, the community colleges had to beat back an initiative to remove general education status. And they had the partnership of their 4-year schools. Something similar has happened in Minnesota. So it's something to keep an eye on. If everything we're talking about today is a fact and we're going to advocate for it, we have to remind our legislatures, above all, that this kind of education matters. It's not just a skill set, it's culture, it's life. That's my soapbox.
Thank you. Thank you, Sharon. Rosemary, pick up from
Thank
there.
you. Thanks, Dan. I'm really happy to be here today to see many familiar faces and to meet new people. I'm also not going to talk about the daughter that I don't have, but my stepdaughter speaks 2 languages natively, well, 3 natively, and her job as a lawyer involves using those 3 languages almost every day, and my son speaks 1 language natively, 1 fairly well, and he uses that 2nd language in his job every day. So, but they're definitely not number 1, so I'll leave that to the others who've claimed those positions. I'd like to talk about 5 concepts to advance our agenda at the higher education level. And I'll give them to you first, and then I'll elaborate a little bit. The first one is technology. The second is alliances. The third is prepared teachers. The 4th is understanding ourselves. And the 5th is advancing higher literacy in English. I'll remind you that the Modern Language Association, as Dan said, we have around 30,000 members, 2/3 of whom are professors or graduate students in English language and literatures and cultures. And the other 1/3 are in languages such as the most commonly taught, Spanish, French, German, and so on, and increasingly the so-called less commonly taught. A lot of expansion in Asian languages, in Arabic, both in enrollments, in the job placements, and of course in the as far as developing literature and culture and our bibliographies and publications. So, onto it. Technology. We've heard a lot about technology today, and in higher education right now, advances in technology necessitate pedagogical changes and approaches. It is to be celebrated that we have increased research and technologies in language pedagogies, and we at the higher education level, post-secondary, expect to spend more time on the advanced cultural and language levels and less time reinventing basic language pedagogies. So I think there's a lot of good news there for effective collaborations among those who work on the technologies of language instruction, language learning, and what we do in post-secondary educational environments. What we do above all is incorporate language learning in an overall humanities education, one in which the basic skills of reasoning, writing, cultural awareness, developing arguments, learning histories, and so on are at the center. My second point about alliances, and this is familiar to those of you who've looked at the 2007 MLA report on foreign languages, New Structures for a Changed World. The MLA believes that we need to make alliances on our campuses so that language learning is done in an environment of collaboration. We know that our students today want much more than what we used to be prepared to give them, which was a curriculum primarily focused on literature, and that we know that the advanced learning that we can bring to students must reach well beyond those students who major in our languages. Therefore, we need to make alliances, and we're making them increasingly on our campuses and beyond our campuses with local communities. So you'll see programs like the one at Mount Holyoke, where the Spanish department is now Latin American, Latino, and Spanish studies, and the local community is actually involved in what's going on in the classroom. So we need to make alliances with professors in history, in humanities centers, in engineering, in architecture, and we also need to make community connections, because languages, as we all know, connect with the wider world, and we have to do more of that on campus. And I think that's one way that we will attract and keep the numbers of students studying our languages. We have to make languages at the college education relevant to what our students want to do. And I think we're in a much better position to do that today than we were even 10 years ago, and certainly 20. The third issue, prepared teachers. There is absolutely no doubt that our teacher training in higher education needs attention. We need to recruit and prepare our best students to go on to be teachers and provide them lifelong learning opportunities so that they themselves are proficient speakers of the languages they teach. We also need grassroots advocacy and other forms of advocacy so that the teachers who are in front of our students at the K through 12 level are in fact prepared and certified, and quit the concept of the soccer coach being also the language teacher outside of her certification. So we absolutely need better preparation and testing, outcome assessment of the fluency level, the language competence level of our graduates, those who graduate with teacher certification and those who graduate with majors in languages. So as we argue in our 2007 report, we should be promoting advanced literacy in our students and testing whether or not we are accomplishing these goals. Fourth, this is about understanding ourselves. It's about ideology. It's about culture. In our country, and we've heard a bit about this morning, one of the fundamental reasons for which language learning is not embraced as a national value is language assimilation or language shift. That ideological or political, psychological move wherein we encourage and force heritage speakers to give up the languages that they came to the United States with and instead adopt English as their primary language. Every single language, Spanish being one notable exception for the sheer numbers of Spanish speakers, every language has undergone this language assimilation. And until we can find ways to convince the larger public that preserving and developing literacy in these languages, those who already have heritage knowledge, is a good American value, we will have still a long uphill battle. And this means not seeing these languages as the languages of our enemies, but of our citizens. and learning languages of our citizens and of our friends as a national value. This also is what higher education teaches in our advanced courses. We teach cultural and linguistic literacy. We teach about cultural analysis and historical analysis. So part of our work in higher education is analyzing these very cultural phenomenon that I'm describing. And finally, learning a language other than English is a primary means of advancing higher literacy in English. Everyone who has acquired a language other than their native language knows this. For many of us, it's the first time that we encounter concepts such as gender, number, grammatical tense and mood, sentence structure, syntax, morphology, and so on. To acquire that linguistic vocabulary and to advance our own native language learning is one of the primary benefits of second language learning. And higher education knows this, K through 12 knows this, and we need to promote this concept much more efficiently and energetically as we go forward. There's a lot more things I'd love to say to you, but I'm respecting Dan's 5 to 7 minutes and turning it back over.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Dan.
Rosemary. Very good. Jackie, would you pick up from there?
On?
Yes.
Yes. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I, too, am very pleased to be here to be part of this conversation today. I found the morning to be totally invigorating in terms of my now wanting to share two sets of thoughts. One from the thoughts that I brought with me in responding to the paper, and then some thoughts that occurred to me as I was listening this morning. So I want to start with the listening part. I spent a lot of time listening. I am one of those English language studies people, and with specialties in rhetorical studies and feminist studies. And I do think that we have to live in the present with some urgency, but we can't really afford to lose sight of how we came to be where we are now. And so one of the things that I was feeling this morning as a sort of elephant in the room is just having the need to acknowledge that we're experiencing here histories of agency, of power, of authority, and entitlement that have permitted Anglophone cultures to operate quite ethnocentrically and not have to choose to move toward multi-language, multicultural readiness. And we need to say that, and so I've said it. And that part of the challenge is that we're going to have to dismantle our desires and expectations related to these histories and hierarchies of power, authority, and entitlement. That is the things that we have to do to get beyond before we can really deal with the challenges that lay ahead of us. Now, I happen to think also that our ability to face the challenges hinges on our being holistic and multidimensional in our vision of what it is that we're trying to do. I think it calls for a multi-sensible approach because, in my view, language and culture learning is a whole body experience. It's not just the learning, it's a whole body experience, not just a non-contextualized learning of the moment. And so when I hear what we talked about this morning in terms of what it means to learn one language, two languages, three languages, I think that we're kind of obligated to move more aggressively toward kind of categorizing some of that language learning. We have students that need, we have people who need a world language. We have people who need a regional language. We have people who need a community language. And we have people who need a home language. And so from where I'm sitting in the context of all that we've been talking about, I think languages for all means that we all need about 4 of them. And we have to figure out how to do that really well. Now, part of what I came here with, though, is that I am Dean of the Ivan Allen College of Liberal Arts at the Georgia Institute of Technology. And more often than not, I face people who have no idea that Georgia Tech has liberal arts. And so I'm always around to say, yes, we do have liberal arts. We have had liberal arts from the beginning, and the Institute is now over 125 years old, but we do it better now than we've ever done it before. And part of it is that the liberal arts at Georgia Tech, that is social sciences and the humanities, come together in a very dynamic way, and we present ourselves as innovation at the crossroads of liberal arts, science, and technology. What that means, though, is that we are not your grandfather's liberal arts. We do things in recognition of the mission-centric way of our institution as an institution that's quite dedicated to making some of the best engineers in the world. We follow that up with engineering is about 60% of what Georgia Tech does. We live in the other 40%. And so part of my job is to make sure that through the liberal arts we help to shape and support the academic preparation of our students, because we have every confidence that they will run, if not rule the world. And part of my mission is to figure out what kind of human beings we want them to be as they do that, how we need to help them to do what they do with a kind of operational sensibility of what it means to be human in the context of other humans who are both alike and not like themselves. And so, of course, language training is a part of that. At Georgia Tech, there is no requirement for language and culture training, none whatsoever. At the same time, we have about 30% of our students who choose to do language and culture training to levels of proficiency. And we have about 60% of them who choose to do some kind of abroad experience. And we don't believe in flybys. We believe in substantive experiences. If you want to go on vacation, do it. But if you want to have an abroad experience, then do it through the curriculum that we offer. And I think we're pretty successful about that. And so again, with that context, I brought plenty of notes. Don't worry, I'm not going to read all this stuff. It was, I'm reflective. I teach writing, or used to once upon a time. So the question that I came with was, what do we need to do to get beyond where we are to be able to grapple with the challenge that we have of languages for all? And I think there are lots of things that we need to consider. But again, the one that is the haunting one is that the mainstream or defaulted culture of the United States is shaped by and functions still within its imperialist, monocultural, English-dominant past, despite the fact, and we know this, despite the fact that since our very beginning, the United States of America has always been multilingual and multicultural. Okay, so that's one of the issues. Now, one of my favorite educators is Anna Julia Cooper, and I don't know how many of you know who she is, but what I take from my study of her as a 19th century woman who lived to be 100, so was a cross-century person, is that you have to treat the truth as if it's true. And so one of the things I think we need to do about multiple languages and multiple cultures in a global environment and in our local environment is to treat the truth as if it's true. In doing so, then, I'm drawn to the question of what does success look like? What can language and culture able students do? How do they function? How did they come to be that way? What persistently happens for these students that just doesn't happen typically for other students who are not language and culture able? In terms of the pyramid that's in the report, how do we graft curricula and pedagogical change onto that pyramid in terms of exposure to language and culture? And I always put the language and culture together. In terms of interaction and integration of home language and culture and other languages and cultures. In terms of knowledge, skills, experience development in country and outside of country, mediated by technologies and not. How do we deal with arena differentiation, that is practice and work arenas or in interest arenas? How do we deal with professional and expertise development? And how do we do all of this with consistency and sustainability? I think it's the sustainability that's one of the issues that we face on a daily basis. Now, at Georgia Tech, without a curricular requirement, we've had to embed and shift our paradigms in a different way. And I think the main way that we've done it is by making language and culture training a part of our strategic planning and strategic goal setting. So we've been able to do that. I think it becomes a matter of investment in and incentivizing innovation in these areas so that it's not just go forth and do. We think very innovatively about how we're going to do it. Make language and culture training a priority as we seek external support, because you can't do it for free. I usually talk about funding almost everything that I do a dime at the time, but it still has to be funded. Making room in the curriculum for innovation and learning. And that room includes making room for faculty who do the work in terms of their own research, education, and service, so that there is some system in the tenure and promotion system and the compensation system to reward what they do. And I think that I will leave it at that, except to say that these are complex issues. And the thing about working with engineers is that you understand quite quickly that complex systems, complex problems require complex solutions.
Thank you. Thank you, Jacqueline. Sam.
Thank you for inviting me to join this panel. I think we've heard some powerful and positive messages coming out of this panel. Very gratifying to see this kind of cooperation on these kinds of issues, because I think what we're hearing is a message, an agenda that's actually very implementable. I, having the fortune to work now, I've been at the National Security Education Program, Defense Language and National Security Education Office for about 2.5 years now. Fortunate to work on not only the language flagship program, but also ROTC Project Go for ROTC students, the African Languages Initiatives, to work with colleagues in the Boren program. And we're seeing some very, very positive things in terms of study abroad, long-term study abroad, intensive study abroad, as well as changing programs on campuses. I think if the question is, what is it that higher education can do, I think that we certainly have some very concrete examples now of what higher education can do. And I think that, building off what's been said here, what we can't do, of course, what higher ed can't do is change the K-12 curriculum necessarily, although higher ed can engage and participate, and we've certainly worked with our partners in higher ed to engage with K-12. I think that one thing that higher education can do is exactly, what you're saying, Sharon, is to articulate what we expect students coming out of K-12 and then coming out of community college to have. What does it mean to have language proficiency? We have tests now. There's no excuse in most languages for saying, well, there's certainly in the languages that most of us work with, there are assessment instruments that we can use and say, here's the goal. And we can work with teachers to try to teach to those goals. We can talk about what other cultural competencies students should have. But I think it's incumbent upon higher education to say to schools, what is it that we expect a Spanish student to walk in with? What is it that we expect someone who took high school Chinese or Arabic to walk in with? And make that very clear and encourage a testing regime just as we do with, we certainly, Georgia Tech doesn't take anyone who doesn't take the math SAT, do they? They certainly don't. So we should, we should be doing the same for language. I think that given some of the pressures that higher education institutions are under, there are two things that the flagship program focuses on that are key in the whole higher education enterprise for solidifying and expanding the place of language and culture and regional expertise within higher education. And that is the pressure to demonstrate results and the pressure to tie studies and results to careers. And that's the model that we're seeing, specifically the language flagship, have a great deal of success in, as well as some of the initiatives under the Bourne program. But I'll speak more about the language flagship, because what the language flagship shows, we're on 22 campuses. We have 26 programs across 10 strategic languages, including now Portuguese. So we are a Romance language program. We have now, under the Bourne program, under the African Languages Initiative, we are including instruction not only in some of the key African languages, there are 2,000, so we had to be selective, but also French and Portuguese, because they're key languages for operating in Africa. Now, what we're seeing under the flagship program, though, is that American undergraduates within a 4 or 5 year program can do the following. They can achieve professional level language proficiency. That means superior on the ACTFL scale, 3 on the ILR scale. That's the level at which we would, confidently send out someone from the Foreign Service Institute, confidently send out someone from Department of Defense to be a foreign area officer or to work in an intelligence field. So we're actually seeing undergraduates achieve this, but they're not just achieving language proficiency. They're working within their academic domains and specialties. So most of the students in the flagship program have a major outside of language. Now, many of them are also language majors, but they have a major in international relations, in business, political science, economics, the sciences, and what they do is that they study at their domestic program. We've ramped up the domestic programs, both by increasing the number of credits and number of contact hours that we have in the first and second year courses. We add tutoring, but what we hope is that as we increase the intensive programs, that we institutionalize this. So that it will be, of course, if you want to learn Chinese to a usable proficiency, it's a 5-unit course plus extra hours, not a 3-unit course. And we've worked with partners to accomplish this. So we have intensified courses, we have additional work in the summer, and that's to get up to the advanced level in order to qualify for the overseas program, which brings students from advanced to superior and offers them not only intensive language instruction in an immersion environment, which is very important because you pick up not only the language, but the culture and the right cultural context in which to use the language, but a direct enrollment in university courses in your field. So if you're a science major, you take science courses. If you're a social scientist, you take social science courses. We don't always get the exact course for the exact major, but we get them in the basically in the right domain to increase their academic vocabulary, their academic expertise within the target language. And then we put them in an internship in a related career field in the foreign country. So you'll see the discourse newsletters on your tables, profile students who've worked in a bio lab in China, on environmental issues in China, doing survey research in Russia, working with a filmmaker in Alexandria, Egypt, before we had to move out of Egypt into Morocco. And these are the kinds of ties to career that are very, very important, that will help us sell the programs on campuses, to our partners on campuses, to the biology department, to the international affairs people, to the public affairs and environment people, to the health sciences, that will sell it on campus, will sell it to the government, and we're partially sold. We still have some advocacy to do within the government, and to the business community, where I think we need a lot of articulation. But businesses will be able to see what a graduate who's worked, for example, in an accounting firm in China, and we visited an accounting firm when we were in Nanjing. We talked with the president of the accounting firm, and her first order of business was, I want an accountant. I don't want, some kid who doesn't know anything about economics. I want an accountant, and they need to be able to speak Chinese well enough to work in my firm. And then they work in that firm for 3 or 4 months. They come back, and they have the kind of expertise that is really lacking in many American firms, at least in terms of our US students being able to go into that kind of position. So, that's where we're at. I think if we can focus on results, to get administrators on board, to get parents on board, to get businesses on board, and career options as we design very high quality language programs, I think that will get us to where we want to go. But it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of institutional support. It takes support from deans, provosts, and presidents and chancellors. And it takes support from students, parents, teachers. And I'll just end with saying, yes, we absolutely need to support the language teachers in this enterprise. That's a key. Teacher training and teacher support is a key to making this work, and being able to integrate the practices that we know are effective.
Thank you, Sam.
Well, the floor is now open for your questions. There's a lot of material and a lot of really good ideas that have circulated here. I'm going to break precedent a little bit, Chairman Breck, by responding to one of the tweets that went by as we were sitting there. I happened to notice it. There probably were others, but the seemingly hypothetical question is, what if K-12 sends a generation of two-level speakers into this system? What do you think would happen then? Let me tell you that this happens to be one issue I've tracked over the last 10 years, and can tell you right now that we're about 24% of the students entering flagship programs have had high school or K-12 training. Those students in general can move directly into the flagship track. They're not held up by elementary, intermediate, or sort of regular standard issue courses. They can go straight to the flagship track. They have a great deal more flexibility, and they can actually move and do their overseas capstone year in their junior year. Imagine that. Right now, those who have had no prior training typically will need closer to 5 years. To do the whole thing. That is, they may need a 5th year to make it if they have to start cold in there. So there's a little bit, that's not a huge data sample, but what we've seen is a very consistent pattern of integration into the flagship system. It's open. Okay, right, start us out, Kurt.
This is particularly oriented toward community colleges, and looking at the other mission of community colleges, not as preparatory for the 4-year sequence, but as a way that you turn to for retraining business
Right.
and the like. But before I get to that, I've got a trivia question for the audience based on Royster's comment with regard to the Anglophone myth of American history and the like. How many of you can name the American president whose native language was not English? Now, back to the question on community colleges. Looking at that question of, retraining and the like, or for that matter, continuing education, refresher courses and the like, what are the inhibitions, or how widespread is the phenomenon of continuing education and languages? Now, Rosemary, I don't think the MLA study addresses the non-credit courses, so I don't know if you may have something to add to that, but that's my question. Thank you.
Well, I'm happy to answer it as best I can. In many community colleges, the workforce development, or the non-credit, and the credit are live in separate universes. That said, I have a very good relationship with my counterpart in workforce development, and those are primarily enrichment courses, I must say. They offer about 10 languages, several of them less commonly taught. They have about 1,000 enrollments a year. And they essentially took over the enrichment from the high schools. So their languages for travel or whatever in the high schools. What's lacking from those is bona fide systematic assessment, which we do on the credit side because of our need to transfer. And so we're very, very careful about that. We have about close to 5,000 enrollments in the credit side annually. So we're very careful about that. One thing that we do is we offer some language for specific purposes that are particularly geared to the community college environment. Nursing programs are huge right now in community colleges. So we do Spanish for medical personnel, things like that, that have a credit component. But it's a really good question. The retooling for very, very serious language students does happen at the community college, but I have to say happens more on the credit side. They'll come to us on the credit side for maybe a little more rigorous kind of training in that area. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a similar part of the high school demographic, particularly of the non-credit after-hours online and Saturday school tradition, which is very notable and worth keeping in mind. Further questions? Objections? Yes. It's Meg.
Okay, Governor Swift said I have to be less polite, so I'm working on that today. First of all, I want to pick up on Rosemary's point about assessment. I think it's wonderful that Dan and others have cited DLI and Flagship and other study abroad studies on language assessment outcomes. But the truth is that we're looking at the Juilliards or the Georgia Techs, you know, the students who are coming in and studying abroad, and we're assessing them then. Where is our outrage for the fact that we have not conducted an assessment of college majors who aren't necessarily attending flagship programs or studying abroad since 1965. And secondly, in terms of articulation, we'll never know if our students coming into the university are ready to jump into flagship unless we reinvigorate the NAEP. Thank you.
Okay, well taken.
I'll take a stab at that. Is my mic working here still? No? I may have fiddled with it inadvertently. There, that should be better. Yes, it is.
There you go.
Takes a second.
I don't know about the outrage, but I would say, where is the visible necessity of assessing outcomes in any learning at the post-secondary level? There's two ways of looking at that from my perspective. One is from without and one is from within. It's no secret that from without means that the accrediting agencies, not to mention programs like Race to the Top, and the loan accreditation issues have forced colleges and universities to have massive learning outcome assessment programs in place. A lot of language programs, and I include English and languages other than English, resist, as many of us do, the push from the outside if it's not organic to what we're doing. For example, how do you measure things such as the ability to go from the reasoning level you came in with to the reasoning level you go out with? How do you measure sensitivity to the multiculturalness of the United States that you may develop as a result of your courses, and so on? So I think the organic from within means finding ways for us to assess our students' learning appropriately. And there are measures and there are ways to do this. And there are many examples of modern language departments who have been successful in establishing a rubric or criteria for assessing language learning. We know that it's not enough to assess oral proficiency. That's just one measure. We need to also assess the higher learning that we expect of higher education. So the ability to carry out research, the ability to draw conclusions from evidence, and so on. So again, I don't know that it's where is the outrage, but where is the need, and then where is the appropriate response to the need. But do I think all graduates who have a major in a language should have their skills level tested? Absolutely. I think that should be a no-brainer in the 21st century.
Sam?
I'd just like to add about the assessment. One of the things that we're finding in the flagship program, though, is that we're able to use it. We're able to use proficiency assessment, and we do it across the skills: speaking, reading, listening, and writing, so that we have a full picture. We're able to use that to feed directly back into classroom teaching. We're using the feedback to improve programs. We're using the feedback to alter the design of intensive study abroad programs, so that we're using it not just as kind of a check-off measure, although it is useful for that. And having been, at a number of programs in other agencies that OMB rated no results demonstrated because we didn't have a measure, and seeing those programs, reduced or zero funded, and I'm talking about programs that I've worked on at State Department of Education and elsewhere. That results not demonstrated is pretty devastating sometimes. I'm not sure we're doing that anymore in the government, but using the feedback has been exceptionally helpful, and getting the outside view along with processes of peer review, and along with processes of kind of institutional assessment, we're able to get a really specific and full picture of what's happening. But I think you're right, the assessment isn't enough. It's the assessment gives an indication, and then coming in for fuller peer review and institutional assessment really allows institutions to address issues and excel.
I think there's a certain multidimensionality about what you're talking about, too, in the sense that there are ways in which we want to be able to judge and monitor progress so we can have this dynamic interplay between the curriculum, pedagogy, and experiences that students are having. There's the program review. There are reviews of faculty and their performance, those kinds of things. But there is that layer also for the students and them having the confidence as they go through programs, and particularly as they complete one, that they're able to function with confidence in whatever arenas they find themselves. And so I don't think we can leave that piece out either.
Thank you. Dr. Brecht, I saw your hand.
I don't need provocation, but here we go. It's wonderful to talk about flagships. I think it has changed our whole thinking about language education and higher education, without question. And but I think it's important to understand that it's not only flagships. There's a movement now, and we have a meeting at the end of October in Austin, where a number of us, with Bob Slater, the founder of Flagship, leading it, where we've invited over 40, Bob, institutions or language programs whose pure incentive is they want to be known as excellent language programs. And what's very interesting, in order to join this coalition, you must submit to peer review, accountability, and assessment internally. There's your internal. It's not coming from outside. There's no government agency or funding tied to it. It is from their own need to know what they're turning out and to tell the students what they're getting and how to integrate that. So now we have over 40 institutions, 40 language programs who want to see whether a coalition of programs like the Holmes Group in education began, whether we can get together and start setting standards that take the flagship programs and models and take that much further out across beyond what the federal government can afford to support. If this works, it is the first kind of seeding and understanding across a broad range of institutions that our language program is excellent, we want to be known for that, and we want to get better, but most importantly, we also want to be part of a national movement to help everyone else. We want to share what we have for everyone else who has the ambition and the willingness to submit to accountability to join us. I think it's important to keep that one in mind.
Well, I happen to think that that flagship is one very provocative model of success. But there are many stories of success, if that's what you're saying. And I think we're obligated to try to figure out where those stories are and how they happen. We really do know how to do this. That's the whole problem. We just need to figure out how to do it at a far more ambitious level than we've ever done it before. And we won't do that unless we look at these models of success. When it happens, well, what does that look like? What are you doing? What are the students doing? What does the program do? What are the experiences that are a part of that process? Because we don't have to stay into when it doesn't work, because we know that we have lots of examples of when it does work. And so this meeting that you're talking about will be a really good and strong first step in articulating much more systematically the threads that make it happen. and in my view, not so much towards standardization as toward values and principles and practices that work.
Wish I could have said it that well.
Now, I'm getting mixed. Are we out of time? Okay, that's what that meant. Okay, I'm sorry. So thank you all very much for your attention and for your strong participation. Particular thanks to our panel for their excellent presentations.
Sounds good.
Thank you, guys.
Oh.
Right on target. Right on target.
I mean, when you put it that way, what's the right answer? Okay. Okay, can we get started? Okay. So we're in that kind of after lunch lull, which is just the perfect, which is why my friend Dick Breck said, Amy, go. But I'm extremely lucky. First of all, I want to have a shout out to my daughter who never met a foreign language that she could learn. You will all be very thrilled to know that the only case ending in Latin is the genitive. It's a very hardworking little engine. And I want to thank her because she took me from the safe world of machine translation and computer science. She made me understand the challenge of learning a foreign language, and I have never looked back. So, Jenna Hornstein, Mommy loves you. Okay. Moving along, what I thought we would do, because we are in that kind of Sahara period of the day, is I've assembled a really fantastic panel that I am dying to ask a lot of questions to on your behalf. So what I thought I would do is just summarize in, the Cook's tour, the nickel tour of what we said in the report, then introduce you a little bit to each panelist, and then ask them some questions. But the introduction is so while I'm yammering on and asking questions, you can figure out the questions that you've been dying to ask. And there will be a quiz, and you will get marked. Okay, so basically the nickel tour of what was in the What Can Research and Technology Offer, there were three things. There was neuro and behavioral science to individualize learning. If you wanted to, and you can read the report for all of the details, but one of the things you need to do if you, want people to go faster is get the learning to the students where they live. And so that means knowing cognitively what different foreign language students look like and figuring out how to individualize instruction. And the report was, we're not there yet, but yes, we can. So you have to figure out, I'm going to ask the panelists, how they think we're really doing in that level. The second major theme was in second language acquisition, the idea that from linguistic science and other areas, there is this notion of systematicity, the same kind of staging, not the same stages, but the same kind of stage-like behavior that characterizes first language learning characterizes second language learning. So in terms of learner management, you want to hit people with instruction when they are ready, and that there are hallmarks that you can look for to figure out where you are on that path. And then the last thing was, so that's a better learner management, better learner modeling, all from both cognitive science and second language acquisition. And then the last thing was the technology. We can slap it all up on a big platform and big data and all the buzzwords, which these guys are going to give some content to, and we're good to go. You drink it all afternoon and we're all ready. And so one of the questions that I'm going to ask all of these panelists, and you should be thinking about, is that believable? What's left out? And how do we translate what we know about research into real actionable intelligence, actionable work that policymakers could really implement? So I'm going to start with with Liz Albro, who sits at the interface between policymaking and research. She is the Associate Commissioner of Teaching and Learning at the National Center for Education Research, in the Institute for Education Sciences at the U.S. Department of Education. Okay, now I'm done. But she supervises research in cognition and student learning. Those are her two portfolios. So first I wanted to ask you, Liz, can you talk a little bit about what IES is, what the role of cognitive and student learning, what the portfolio does, and does your group deal with foreign language work? So take it away.
Is it working? There it goes. All right. So thanks a lot so much for having me here. This has been a really fascinating morning. I am enjoying this both as a parent and as a researcher. I have to tell you that thinking about foreign language acquisition is something that I've thought long and hard about over many years. I want to correct Amy just a little bit here in that I don't actually sit at the intersection of research and policy making. IES is the independent research arm of the Department of Ed, and so I am actually, there's a firewall between the research arm and the policy making office. So I just want to make that clear that is not my role. Our role is to carry out or to support research that can be used to inform both policy and practice. So cognition and student learning is part of the portfolio that I oversee, but we also oversee a portfolio on reading and writing, on post-secondary support in terms of schools and learning, as well as our portfolio on English language learners. And I really need to say that sort of from where I sit within the Department of Education, the mission of the department is really to figure out how we can serve our lowest achieving students. So the panel that we just heard in the discussion about flagship universities really resonated with me in the sense that the research that we support on the applied end is really how do we help those students who are not succeeding in school to do better. And for those of you who know the work in the area of English learners, a large proportion of students who do not succeed through elementary and high school are those who are English learners. So I want to kind of flash back to the beginning of the morning where there was this discussion of the fact that we wanted to get to this 50%, right, of the basic kids who have basic dual language abilities, and we have almost a quarter of a percent of kids in our country who already come to school with a second language, right, or with a first language, right, and they're trying to learn a second language. And I think I want to encourage us to think about what we are learning from a research perspective on how to support English learning, and think about whether that can actually help us in terms of how we try to understand second language learning. And I'm going to use that term foreign language learning, which is really not a term I like, but I do think there are benefits to learn from both of those. So in terms of from the cognitive perspective, there's clearly a deep history that suggests that there are benefits from learning two languages at once. But I think that we are in dire need of additional work to know whether that is a result, how do I want to say this? That's a result of training as opposed to a result of opportunities, right? So many students who are embedded in dual language immersion, and I was really pleased to see that our Portland study is cited in the report, where we're actually looking to see if kids are lotteried in to dual language immersion, if in fact that experience gives us kids from across the economic spectrum, from across the backgrounds, who come out at 12th grade with language proficiency. And I don't think that we know the answer to that question. I think it's an open question. I don't want to dominate because I know you want to have a conversation here. The only other thing that's really resonated with me over the course of the day is the teacher training piece of this, the teacher learning piece. We do have a portfolio of research trying to figure out how do we support K-12 teachers in terms of teaching literacy skills, right? Reading, writing, and language skills. And I think that we continue to struggle with knowing how best to support our teachers from a research perspective, right? We struggle with teaching, with providing language instruction in English as well as other languages. I think we have a lot to learn still.
Can you say a little bit about how you define IES gets requirements, define requirements, and how requirements get translated into actual results? What the department's going to do?
All the way to the results, right? That's the part that I can't get to necessarily, right?
You can't do it, but who takes the ball?
So certainly. So we have the director of the Institute of Education Sciences sets our priorities. Those priorities are vetted for our National Board of Education Sciences, which include a group of esteemed experts, right? Academics, practitioners, as well as members of the sort of business community, the youth community. And the charge really in our legislation was how do we help improve outcomes for the kids who are most at risk of failing? So that's the big priority. Then our directors lay out a set of priorities which are all-encompassing. And then we have a set of research programs which are actually pretty broadly defined. So we have an education research grants program which covers the gamut from early childhood education all the way up through post-secondary and adult. And it's essentially a field-initiated program so that researchers in the community are invited to put applications into us. The other part that's something new that I think is really important, particularly for those of you who sit in school districts around the country to know about, is we have a researcher-practitioner partnership program where we are actually trying to support research that's tackling some of these critical questions from the practitioner perspective. So building partnerships to go together. I still didn't answer your question.
Well, say a little bit more about this researcher-practitioner partnership. How do you decide what are the good partnerships and what are the most important partnerships to foster Department of Ed priorities or national priorities?
So we fund our research through a peer review process. So it's dependent upon the peer reviewers, and we ask that folks come in with strong, well-established partnerships and that they identify problems of national importance and that they convince their peer review panel that we have adequate information, that we have good data to try to solve this problem, and that we'll be able to make a leap forward in terms of science and our understanding of those problems.
And so foreign language doesn't seem like it's right at the center of what IES does, but what research that is at the center do you think is synergistic, and could there be sort of a virtuous circle between the things that this group is tackling and what's really at the core?
So I think, to go back to this morning, and I'm terrible with names, so I'm not going to remember, but this notion that language is becoming a central component of K-12 education through the implementation of college and career standards, I think that there is a real opportunity now to help the country and the research community and the education community think about features of language, regardless of what language that is. I really think that there's a lot to learn about that. We've been working very hard to see how we can improve reading and writing across lots of things that we do, and that there are many opportunities for that.
You said something about the disadvantaged populations, and we know from research in first language acquisition that, for example, the very early age, if you don't tackle the English language problem, or even if you don't tackle, if you're a kid from a disadvantaged family, so you don't know what academic language is like, you can spend years making up for that. I mean, it would seem to me that for those kids, English is the foreign language, and by helping to tackle those kind of issues, we might be able to pipeline back into the same kind of problems for foreign languages. So that may be a way for foreign language stuff to, get in through, if not the back door, the side door.
Amy needs to sit in my chair. That was really well said. I think absolutely.
Is there any other research that we didn't focus on in the report that you think we should have that would be relevant?
I do think that, I think it would be helpful for us to think about this notion of languages as encompassing literacy. I do think a lot of the discussion today was really focused on spoken language and proficiency in terms of things like negotiation, but we heard from the business community that writing and being able to, I guess writing is the primary, but writing and reading in a second language and doing that proficiently both in English and in the second language, we still have a lot to learn about the best ways to support that through K-12 and in higher ed. So I think I would encourage us to think about how to incorporate that.
Thanks, Liz. Sure. So that's, you can now think and write what you're going to ask her, because we will get back to everybody. Okay, but we'll turn to Don Fisher. Don is currently the president of the Defense Language Institute Foundation, and he previously served as the Institute Commandant and as its provost. I don't know if there's a job there that you didn't do. While at DLI, he spearheaded the integration of technology into the Institute's on-campus and distance or blended learning programs. Before any of you mess with him, you should know that his military decorations include the Defense Superior Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star for Meritorious Service, and the Meritorious Service Medal, and the Army Commendation Medal. So he was ready for battle for language, and sharp. Let's not go there. And so that prepared him for the language wars at an institute that had a lot of jobs that they had to fulfill. So, Don, let's turn to your work at DLI. DLI has a really strong web presence. Anybody who wants to even get a peek, just go to dli.edu. A lot of the content on there was put together during Don's various tenures. So can you talk a little bit about how technology was integrated in your curriculum, and if any of that could transfer to K through 16?
Sure. First, a shout out to my son.
Not allowed.
Who learned German from birth and Arabic at DLI.
All right.
They're out there. Guys are also learning language. But at any rate, we kind of worked from need, and the big impetus for technology at DLI happened in the 90s when the Army, first we saw the Mac with the voice chip, and we kind of gambled that the Windows people would come up with something. They came up with Sound Blast, and from there we just started on to the day now where every student has an iPad and every student has a MacBook Pro, and those students are working on the virtual side every day to design exercises. We use. I'm sorry. No, wait a minute.
I'm not hearing you very well. Is it off?
It's technology.
It's technology.
Technology, Okay. At any rate, we based technology was need-based. Just like learning your first language is need-based, we had a need for technology, and we saw the capability of doing drill and skill and what had been done audio-lingually could be delivered in much more economical ways. The second thing that we jumped into was the Army started this video teletraining program with Oklahoma State University. And we jumped into that because we saw that after people left the DLI, they needed some way to get more training to sustain their proficiency and so on and so forth. So, at that time, it cost us $100,000 a month to do it. And now, of course, with Google Hangout and with GoToMeeting and with Illuminate environments, these virtual environments are there for the taking every day. So there's not really an inhibitor with Skype and Google Hangout to using technology to leverage very scarce teaching resources to teach your more exotic languages. And we use that to teach truck drivers basic survival stuff prior to going to Iraq for Desert Storm and Desert Shield. And in the end, after a very short time, a couple of years, we were delivering to 66 sites across the states. As far as using the computers in language instruction, we provided some promotion incentives for our teachers to start using the Mac. And right now at DLI, it's one of the elements of their performance review that they have to report on is how they're using technology to support their language instruction that they give every day. And in order to bring our teachers up to speed, we used Dr. Quaylen Chen, who's also here, used the Gary Stahl group cognition paradigm, where you bring a bunch of voices in virtually to kind of equalize the playing field, but you can have 18 to 30 people on the network at one time contributing, working synchronously, doing presentations, and giving virtual presentations as a kind of a situated way to use your technology. So that's how we really forced it into the curriculum. And of course, one of the things that I learned over time was, and just had that realization as I approached the end of my career, is that teachers age and don't change. Teachers teach the way they were taught. I went to school before fluorescent lights, and and really I would be using a flashlight and chalk on a board if I taught the way I taught. But students don't age, but they change every year. And so what we have to have is these types of environment where we can keep our teachers at the cutting edge so that they're using the tools that the students are going to use for learning and not looking at some golden age when a pencil and a ballpoint pen seem to have a lot more importance than they do today.
So you said you did a lot of work and you rated teachers based on their use of technology. It clearly wasn't like, did you use it 5 hours a week? What were some of the most successful integrations of technology, and what were some things that you tried and you were kind of like, never mind?
Well, most of our use of technology has been very successful. What really happens, is the older teachers who have learned under different systems, you have to spend some energy getting them into it and convincing them. And what we did with that is we brought the teachers together and paired them up with teachers who were adopters, and they were teachers that didn't. And what the teachers that hadn't used it, or maybe had poor English skills or weren't technology proficient, they saw that they could do it. And then we required them to use elements of technology to show them that they could do it. And after that, once they saw that they could, we hit a kind of a takeoff period on that. The other thing, of course, was putting the computers in the hands of the students. The students don't wait for the teacher. And what they do is they begin collaborating with each other. They begin designing lessons. It's one of the beauties of the Transparent Language CL 150 program is the students can design their own learning exercises. And when they get a good vocab list, they'll share it with each other, and you begin to have a kind of a Wikipedia approach to developing technology and learning objects that you use inside inside your system, and you can even transmit them outside so that they're available to the K-12 community. And of course, I say to everyone that's in the K-12 or in the post-secondary community now, go to sites like the DLI site, because there's all kinds of free resources there that you can use. Like Duolingo is another, Innovative Language is another, Schola is another. You have tons of resources out there that if you don't have the text and you don't feel that you can start one, you really can start one, and you can use distance capabilities and technology to leverage assets that may be far away from you, but you can create an environment where learning can take place. If I had to rethink anything about it, it had to be with the time constraints that were on me as commandant. You know, the teachers over there know that a commandant's only going to be there about 3 years, so they can wait them out. So, and that happens to be with provosts, no matter how old they get, too, you know. But at any rate, I was always pushing, and I was always saying, give me a C- product today and we'll get to A+ faster. Get something out there and start working it. Now, I've since upgraded that to about a B-, but at any rate, get something going. And at times, I know that generated a lot of stress. And I should have probably stepped back. But, you know, if you step back, you never get there. And so as Dr. Ray Clifford, my predecessor, he's former president of ACFL, told me when I asked him as commandant, how do you get change at DLI? And he says, well, it's like moving an elephant. He says, you lean against it, when it shifts its feet, it'll move in your direction. and of course, the realization came to me that an elephant can sit on you, and something rhymed with that, so don't look up.
Okay.
Next.
All right, if that didn't wake you up from your lunchtime slumbers, we've got more. Okay, so one of the things people look to technology for is to drive the cost down of learning. And you've talked about a blend of teacher and technology at DLI, you know, mostly for the in-classroom experience. So can you say a little bit about what technological capabilities we can marshal today that will drive the cost down? What things would you have liked to do that the technology's just not there? Because that's where the research is going to come to fill those gaps.
Well, I would say that because we're in Department of Defense and because it was need-driven, you know, we got some hardware that you all would kill for. And like I say, if I could sit there as the commandant and with Craig Wilson's help over there, pull out $100,000 a month to start the laboratory with Oklahoma State University and draw some benefit, that's something that you can't do. However, putting out hardware and setting up networks is a universal problem. You have it regardless of your discipline. So there are some districts that have it and some that don't. There are some universities that have it and some that don't. That's the elephant you have to lean on to get moving. But in the meantime, don't deprive the ones that have by waiting for the ones that have not. And so in that case, you've got things like Chromebooks and some fairly cheap laptops and so forth, and some client cloud type things that can mitigate your costs. In terms of software and materials, you have the DLI site that's no cost. The Joint Language University has thousands of objects and curricula there that could be made available to K through 12 and post-secondary. You have the StarTalk work with the National Foreign Language Center. You have CASL research that's out there doing that. Tap into that. They'll show you issues and how people have dealt with them. You have Schola that is getting copyright-free materials and learning objects being developed that you can use immediately in your school. There's the Transparent Language CL 150 program, or his Before You Know It, BIKE. There was one guy that said, I don't like Transparent CL 150. I found a better thing. It was Transparency Before You Know It. So Duolingo is terrific. They've got 6 or 7 Romance languages. They teach you how to read, speak, write, and listen. And a beautiful methodology developed by Carnegie Mellon. Doesn't cost anything. You have the Udacity interactive YouTube video approach where You get a 5-minute presentation, and then there's a software layer put on top that says, okay, now you do it. I took a Udacity Java course, which is kind of like learning Russian or something like that. And what they would do is they'd tell us the concept, and they say, here's what we want you to do with it. The computer would parse the result and let you move on. Or you worked on a conference system with other students to get the problem out. And at the same time, they were using the big data approach where the student was getting the feedback, but the teacher was getting the feedback to see who was participating, but also how effective each presentation was. So that was the kind of terrific thing. And you've got Coursera that are doing basically the same thing, and it's all out there. And then one very interesting program that Software Set I saw was Innovative Language, where they're teaching 26 different languages, Roman, Arabic, Chinese, and so forth. And the basic part that would support probably a semester of high school or junior high school instruction is all free. You don't start paying until you're at the intermediate and advanced. So these are the kind of assets that are available to you all just by putting in language learning programs into your Google.
Do you see, though, I mean, if you took what you just said, I'm pretty sure you didn't mean it like this, but to its logical conclusion, I'll stick you on Udacity, I'll give you Coursera, I'll give you this platform, and where's the teacher?
Well,
So is it a substitute for a teacher? Where is the part where the teacher is absolutely, you can't do without it? And where do you think, if we look towards the future, because remember, we're trying to make this economical. So we don't want to get the teachers out of the room. Everybody knows. There was that quote in the report where Bill Gates says that the main thing about school was teaching. I'm like, really? I mean, for this, you made billions of dollars? I don't think so. I think we all know that. But where are the next steps where right now technology really is silent? What would we have to do next to support teachers?
Well, I think that what can happen with technology is you can move the teacher away from being the sage on the stage and spending a lot of preparation time to the guide on the side. That's simplistic, but the teacher needs to be there as the accountability mechanism. You need to make sure that the student is doing the work. My son and his partner teaching language arts down in Albuquerque just increased the results on his students for proficiency testing by 25%. The factor that was in there that as they analyzed it was the students who did the work that improved. What a concept. And so, but what we can do is, for example, with Udacity or Coursera, I'm trying to advocate that a kind of a national curriculum could be developed. Not one that would be forced on people, but teachers would use it if it was valuable, where you could prepare these short clips on things that are constant in the language business, such as the difference between ser and a star in Spanish, or the 3 and 5 and 7 word roots in Arabic. You could present that, and then the teacher could look and see the output, could see which students were getting it. And that's where the big data comes in, where, like in Texas, as Dr. Richard Culata talks about in his video, Reimagining Education, he says they're doing cursor time analysis. If a person hits a multiple choice answer right away, that's recorded. If they take time and they're obviously guessing, then they feed material that deals with that particular weakness that's been adapted. So as Ray Clifford again said, technology won't replace teachers, but teachers who don't use technology will be replaced. And so the teacher has a very important role to know what is the repertoire of tools, of clubs in that golf bag that can get each individual student working and moving so that they enjoy what they're doing.
Thank you, Don. Okay, we're going to move to my colleague and partner in crime at the University of Maryland, Nan Bernstein-Ratner. Nan is professor and chairman of the Department of Hearing and Speech Science at the University of Maryland. And Nan is one of those people who took a department that was sort of a traditional department and made it not your grandmother's hearing and speech. In the same way that we want to do for language science in general, she added neuroscience and other things to the classic, always important language difficulties, both for comprehension and production. So she's sort of a leader in that. She received the Distinguished Researcher Award from the International Fluency Association. Her main work is on stuttering and psycholinguistics, but I wanted her to talk not only about her own work, but how you transform a university department from doing what it always did into being the kind of change agent that we're going to need if we're going to take the next step. She is also, as Dr. Lowe, President Lowe, mentioned this morning, one of the mainstays behind the Language Science Center, which is led by my colleague Colin Phillips, because we want to make Maryland a change agent to do the kind of things that you all are talking about as important today. So, Nan, you've done work on the time course of language. We were talking about systematicity in the report as an important driver for better language instruction. So you've done work on the time course of language development in normal children and those with speech difficulties. Do you see any parallels between this work and second language or foreign language acquisition?
I do, but since, whoops, where's my mic? I do, but since we're talking about children, I thought I'd mention also, given my position here at Maryland, that about 6 to 8% of children in the schools will come in disordered in first language acquisition and not just not able to learn language because of inadequate exposure like an ELL. My son was one of those. And what used to be thought, by the way, in our field is that if you were disordered in learning your first language, you really couldn't learn a second language very well. And I used to give out waivers when we lived in Boston, all of us, to students who didn't want to take foreign language classes at BU, claiming that they were somehow language impaired. And I think what we've learned through our colleagues is that language disabilities actually look very different in different languages. And so it is possible for a child who doesn't do very well with English, for instance, to do well in a second language experience, and my son did. But as a sort of linguist myself, I had to sit down and think whether or not he was going to be good in a language like French, where a lot of things are hidden in spoken form, or Spanish, where they're laid out in the open and they're more regular. And I think these are things that we'll have to think about to make sure we don't permanently disenfranchise the 6 to 8% of kids who do have problems learning English, and we don't want to leave them out of this equation because they can get success in learning different languages, including some of the ones most of us would find very hard, like Arabic languages with all of those infixes. In terms of what we're learning from language development and language disorders, it's pretty obvious now that you can predict in advance what sorts of things people find difficult to do in a language. In a sense, the things that children acquire late are most often impaired when children have problems, and they're the most difficult for second language learners to acquire. Yet I don't get a sense from my own background or from the literature that we're drawing the curricula that way. I get a sense that we're sort of hitting basic concepts in a language as they were somehow laid out by a linguist. And we're not really paying attention to the sorts of things that are regular cues that kids find easy to pick up, second language learners find are easy to pick up. We're not using very much of a developmental approach in teaching second language, even though sometimes we do a pretty good job of implementing it in testing, certainly for new learners. So I think that we could take advantage of the research that really allows us to speculate what will be easy and hard for people to learn, regardless of what language they're learning, because there do seem to be some pretty universal cues for that predict very well. There's a kind of a taxonomy of about 8 features you can use to predict which things emerge first in second language or in first language. And use it. I also think that we're learning that there are interference effects from going to from one language to another. I think that in most of the time in second language instruction in classrooms in the United States, we're sort of starting from a position where that doesn't matter because everybody speaks English. But when you're trying to bring up the English language learners, that's a different situation. And I think it's pretty clear to people in research. I do research in psycholinguistics that basically if you come to language 2 from a different language 1, you're going to have different problem spaces to encounter and reconcile. And so certainly for the English language learners and for people engaged in more diverse forms of language learning across the globe and interacting, whether you come, say, to English from Chinese or vice versa, or Spanish, it probably does make a difference. And I think we need to explore whether or not certain types of classes that don't now consist of homogeneous learners picking up a homogeneous second language, whether or not that's correct, whether or not we should do it a little bit differently. The other final thing I'll say at this point is that what we've really learned over the past 20 years is how much we know early in life and how much we start unlearning early in life. And it kind of emphasizes the old argument about critical periods, but puts it in a new framework, so that we know now that you can predict language learning disorders in children from cues that we pick up before they've ever learned to talk at all. Neurological signatures, responses to laboratory tasks. And at that point, we also know that typical language learners, in a sense, learn by unlearning, so that when we're learning our native language, we conveniently, and I think necessarily, start narrowing our perception of sounds that we don't use in our language, and the kinds of things that appear in the structure of our language that doesn't appear to be relevant for us. They would have been relevant if we had been born somewhere else. And so the more we learn about early development we really are putting a new framework on the notion of early intervention, which we use in the field to talk about getting in when people are going to have problems and fixing them early. But I think it pertains to this field in amazing ways, because basically the earlier you get in there and do something, the better off your payoff is going to be. And that's certainly something that everybody said earlier today. But it is this kind of thing when somebody got up and said, "Where's the outrage?" I mean, basically, we've known ever since I was a student in this field, and I'm way old, that we knew that there were critical and sensitive periods for development. And all we've done over time is we've pushed them further and further down to the point where we know that there's so much that goes away as we age, even before we hit preschool. And so, where is the outrage that we're not, in fact, teaching Maryland history in 11th grade and teaching languages in first grade? I mean, what is this about? And it's stuff that was in books years ago. And I would just say in a heartfelt way that when I teach my undergraduate psycholinguistics class, and we go over these basic principles which are so well attested, the thing that you hear students at the university say is how criminal it was to put them through language learning in middle school and high school that they got virtually nothing usable out of, when we as scientists know that it wasn't going to work. Why did we do that? Why are we so far behind in implementing science in the curriculum?
So from that passionate note, first of all, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, everything that you've said about trying to predict things from neural signatures, that's the kind of work that we're doing at CASL. In the national security arena, because you can't wait until the crisis is over to have people come in with their third or fourth language. We have to look to cognitive science to both deal with the challenges of having more than one or two languages in your brain, but also pick up from the fact that as somebody who's learned languages before, you have an individual style, you know how you learned language. And so, again, putting this all together, the technology provides a platform, perhaps, for a teacher in a busy classroom with 30 people or 30 kids to maybe individualize to these different profiles if we only got the research right. So it's you all need to get together and talk. Okay, one final question for you, then we'll move on to Joan. So you've been in an area where you've been a leader in trying to apply research findings to the actual practical applications. What lessons can you give this group who don't want to just sit and be the choir and be the smartest kids in the room and we know all the research answers if nobody's going to do anything with it? What should we learn from your hard experience or good experience about making the case?
Ooh, that's a tough one, and you didn't prep me.
I did.
Well,
it's number 4.
I don't think number 4 was in the email.
Never mind.
All right. I think you have to do some selling, as people said this morning. I think that we have a physicist working in my department now. We have a couple of psychologists. We have had medical doctors on our faculty. I think that it's been a challenge, and it still is. I'm not going to kid you, for people not to say, why are we bringing so many people into our department that don't actually have degrees in our field? I think it's hard. I think you have to sell them on the return and the fact that increasingly we're not working in silos on any of these problems. And the diversity of everybody who came up here today to talk is just one testament to that. It is certainly a much more integrated and widespread kind of conversation than we typically have. So I think we have to sell things. And I think we have to sell them way beyond the level of departments. I had this sort of random thought when I was sitting listening to all these talks that just people walking around don't understand language. They don't understand how it's learned. They take for granted what it gives them in life. And because I had a conversation recently with somebody who was looking for a a caretaker for her child, and you see so many ads go in the American papers for somebody who speaks fluent English, which is just insane. That we have to somehow get in the minds of otherwise very smart people the notion that children learn language from exposure and interaction from the people they're with normally, and that we almost start the process of deprivation in some of the highest ranked households deliberately because we have misconceptions about what goes on in language learning. I think that you just have to, we do have to have more events like this where people can talk to one another. I also think that there are serious challenges between, say, a technology field and mine. I mentioned to you that we do great now at speech recognition. We do better than, I had a professor who told me we'd never get to the point where Siri was around, and we know Siri is around. But those programs still do very poorly with children. Children's voices do not have good speech recognition programming behind them right now, or people with significant accents. So I think that we do have, it's not just the platforms and how we transmit information, but programming for these kinds of difficulties that we have to be talking to one another, because I work with a constituency that tends to get forgotten. Certainly little kids are forgotten in many of the discussions of foreign language teaching, and certainly people with difficulties, and they have this basic problem with some of the technology we're talking about.
Great, thank you. Okay, Joan, hi. It's not going to be that bad. Okay, Joan Mailing is a program manager in the Social and Behavioral Science Directorate of the NSF. She has responsibilities for programs in linguistics and documenting endangered languages, among other things. She is also the vice president and president-elect of the Linguistic Society of America, so she's willing to take on challenges. She has a distinguished career as a professor at Brandeis, where she worked on and was internationally recognized for her work on syntactic theory and Germanic, Icelandic, and Korean syntax, and she also founded one of the major journals of our field. So let me start talking to you as a linguist. So if you read our report, it was kind of slap on a little neuro, a little SLA, technology platform, you're good to go. So as a linguist, what do you think the role of linguistics is in improving foreign language education in this country?
This is actually, it's a huge challenge, and one that I think is surprisingly hard to answer. In part because
it's on. Okay.
In part because There's been a divide between, I think, sort of theoretical linguists on the one hand and I'd say language educators. Very often, linguistics is a separate department from the foreign language, and in very few campuses that I know of do those two communities actually interact and have any meaningful dialogue, which is I think a serious problem and something that we need to address. It's not just foreign language or second language instruction. I think it's true in in our mother tongue classes, English language arts or whatever it's currently called. When as I said, I taught at Brandeis for over 30 years. I taught linguistics. I was always surprised by the freshmen who would come into my classes and express surprise that as a linguist, I really believed that language was a system, that that there were patterns and generalizations. They came out of high school thinking that language was either just a bunch of exceptions, and you think, well, don't you have to have a system to be an exception too? But never mind. Didn't seem to bother them. Or they had the usual kind of myths about language and language learning that certainly the white paper addresses and that everyone in this audience is familiar with. And sort of preparing for this, if you haven't seen the TED Talk by Kim Potowski of the University of Illinois at Chicago, it's called No Child Left Monolingual. It's a very nice little, very energetic presentation of why all those myths about bilingualism, I guess or multilingualism, we use them as more or less synonyms in this forum, have been shown by research. I mean, now we actually have research that shows that bilingualism is not a disadvantage either at the level of society or at the level of the individual. Certainly in quite recent years, of course, the media has given a lot of attention to the research showing that bilingualism may give us a cognitive advantage in later years and stave off cognitive dementia and so on. That's gotten a lot of play. I think what's gotten a lot less play, but is something that has come up in this audience again and again, is the research that shows that learning two languages at once or in the school system is not going to confuse the child or impede their knowledge of their mother tongue and so on and so on. So I think we need to do a much better job of getting the results of what research has been done out there and to inform the education. And to do that, then we need to have more discussions like this one, where the theoreticians and the teachers who are working in the trenches, can get together and exchange ideas.
So now let me ask you about, in your role as at the NSF, you have a major effort that stemmed out of a report called Rebuilding the Mosaic, which was a big activity in the Social and Behavioral Directorate. And there are a variety of activities coming from that. Your SBE does not engage in research on foreign language teaching directly, but in terms of fellow traveling, what research that is of interest you think would be relevant, and how can we establish this kind of dialogue between the second language field and the things that NSF is interested in?
So I'm not sure how much of it comes out of the Rebuilding Mosaic report per se, but let me just say a little bit about what NSF does and does not fund. So in a sense, I'm a little bit of an outlier at this particular discussion table, both because it's not my own research area and simply because language education or pedagogy is not part of the purview of the National Science Foundation. Other people, Congress determines, or what we do and do not support. So what NSF does support is basic science. Some of it descriptive, all of it, I think, strongly grounded in theory rather than in applications. But certainly the translation to practice is not the sort of is not the focus of the kinds of research that NSF funds, but it is definitely what is one of what has now become known as broader impact. So there's certainly an interest for that. The linguistics program supports also documentation projects on endangered languages. So language diversity is something that's of primary interest to linguists, just because, if only because it's the raw material of our discipline. So documenting endangered languages, I should say, is a joint partnership with the National Endowment for the Humanities. Clinical studies, of course, of the type that Nan was talking about, where you're looking at, say, atypical development, or actually at both ends of the lifespan, are supported primarily by the National Institutes of Health, various institutes there. So those also fall outside of the purview of NSF, except insofar as there are interagency kinds of programs. We also don't fund literacy research per se, other than quantitative literacy or research related to the STEM disciplines, STEM meaning science, technology, engineering, and math. So for the most part, the social sciences that are funded at NSF are considered STEM sciences, but not from the not when we're talking about basic literacy. That falls to the Department of Education. And as Liz said, they have an Institute of Education Sciences, a program that supports that research. What we do have that have been sort of emphasized or highlighted in the Mosaic report are foundation-wide solicitations that require interdisciplinary research teams. So this is, I think, certainly we've seen a big change over, I don't know what lifespan, but from research in particular disciplinary programs to ones that emphasize collaborative partnerships between scholars who normally probably wouldn't get together, to do work. So I think that's really exciting. We see around the world, of course, many centers have sprung up that focus on second language acquisition, bilingualism in particular. Some of that we see in the U.S. Some of it is NSF funded. IGRT programs like the one that that led to
Thank you very much.
The Maryland Language Science Center, which was officially launched on Friday.
That's on the quiz.
There's also a National Heritage Language Resource Center at UCLA. So work on heritage languages has, I think, basic research on heritage languages and how they're learned. Both language acquisition and language attrition has become a big area for basic research. Again, NSF is not funding the sort of the translation part of that, but we are funding the basic research that would presumably, be the start of that conversation, and which is certainly one of the challenges that we face.
Right, the translational places like us
is
taken
absolutely
to the field. Okay, so we promised before we're done, and we're going to take just 2 more minutes, that you could have at this really distinguished panel. So we have time for 2 quick questions. Any questions for the panelists? Yes.
I believe this is on. I was just wondering, as we're talking today, we make language learning really kind of boring. You go to school, and also we're worried about kids losing their ability to language. Have we ever approached any of the gaming companies like Wii, Nintendo, or anything like that to do their games in other languages?
Yes.
And not only would that keep the kids learning their language, but they'd be playing with each other in the language, but I also think adults would have a whole lot more fun learning the language. And I'm just, I'm DOD, so I'm thinking like Black Ops, if that was in, Arabic or some other language, we might get our military into really playing it and going after it. And
so
it would just...
funny you should ask. CASL sponsored a gamers with FSI collaboration, as a matter of fact, and there's Marcia Kaplan from the FSI. we sponsored a gaming meets language encounter. And I think it was kind of interesting because you first of all saw that it was hard. The gamers said, you know, ugh, there's this serious game stuff that you learning people keep talking about, and there's either games or you're serious, and get with the program. But I think by the end, people realized that, yes, there were synergies. There's a big research institute at North Carolina State that's going to be working with the Laboratory for Analytic Sciences where they do gaming. So yes, people are looking at that problem. And at my own center, we are actually putting working memory training, which is to get your cognitive architecture more ready. When we started, and I hope my colleagues aren't listening, it was kind of boring. It was like really boring, like everybody attrited because they didn't want to finish, even though when you paid, we knew it helped because when you paid people, undergraduates, they all completed it and their training was great. So we decided, one of my area directors, Mike Bunting, are you here? There he is. He said, you know, Amy, we could have 50 more campus studies and who cares? We have to get with the gamers and have an engaging game. So we have on mobile apps, people think they are playing Black Ops kind of games, but they're really training their working memory.
Well, and like I say, if they would do it in the languages of itself, one, I can see where they retain the language, but also it would get their speed up. Because I know when you speak, you learn to speak, it's blah, blah, blah. But when you get to the country, they go a whole lot faster.
Correct.
You know, it's very different.
Joan, you wanted to say something?
Well, it doesn't directly tie into your question, but it seems to me the one thing that your white paper did not address, which I think is the greatest challenge, greatest Anglophone challenge, and that is instilling the motivation in the kids.
Right.
Because when you get down to it, it's all going to depend on the children wanting to learn and to use the language. To some extent, I think technology is going to be a large part of the picture. I could give you some talk about plenty of case studies of situations where, despite a great deal of support from governments, money, education, and what have you, I mean, all of those efforts have had quite mixed success. Irish Gaelic is an excellent example because they've spent over 100 years with great support from the government, and yet, very sadly, I mean, there are now reports saying that although, say, at the teenage level, you still see a wide range of competency, children under 10 are apparently all the evidence is that they are simply, they're not interested. And how do you do that? And I'm sure we all, probably everybody in this room has anecdotal, evidence from our kids. I certainly could, but they don't want. I speak for my sons also don't want to learn a language. The Irish language, Jim McCloskey reports the same thing, sadly, of his own sons. You can't make them. So somehow we have to do a better job of reaching them. Yes, it's important that the parents want to do it, that the schools, that everybody else, but at some level, ultimately, we're also going to have to make that it's got to start. And therefore, the earlier we start, I mean, there's a way of making science, language science, linguistics, all of these things exciting at an age before we have kind of, the system has come in and said there's only one right way to do things and one right answer.
Last word, Liz, and then we'll move to the government.
So I was...
Oh, no, you are the government.
I am the government.
Yeah, we have the government, right.
So I just wanted to jump in because I was sitting here scribbling notes as you all were talking, and motivation is a word that I have here highlighted and in brackets, and was something I meant to mention earlier, because I think motivation is critical not only for language learning, but for mastering reading and writing skills.
Yes.
So one of the things when I think about what we know about adolescent literacy, which is really where my expertise lies, we know that kids' reading abilities sort of appear to drop off, and it appears to be correlated with changes in motivation. So I just want to echo that. I think motivation is a critical component to improving language learning, however you define it, across the age spectrum. And we fund gaming through the Small Business Innovation Research Program that we have at ED. So I'd be happy
FYI.
to...
Okay, with that, I want to really thank the panelists. You guys were great. Thank you so much. them. Dix.
Just this morning, I got Terry Langevin sent me a paper by Andras Korné at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences called "Digital Language Death," and so he's done an assessment of the degree to which speakers of various languages are actually using the media, tweets and the wiki, blah 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 blah. As are they communicating in that language? And so it's a new way of measuring language vitality, which it picks up with this thing, and it's going to fit into everything, and it fits into the Anglophone, and it has to come from the younger generation. I could no more make up a game, but it's got to come from, Andras Korné, I can send you the link. It's a really nice. I haven't had a chance, but a really an important thing. I think that. So very interesting talking, for example, about that. You can see in Norway, between Nynorsk and Bokmål, that they aren't tweeting, they aren't using Nynorsk at that level. The government's still supporting it, but he said the people have voted that with their tweets, they're tweeting in only one.
They have a fan base that wants to talk to
Oh,
you.
okay. Help.
To see you. See you.
The volume off? No, you don't. Thank you.
You want to speak, you have to wait until I go back here so I can mute you. But
Okay.
otherwise, keep it on.
Okay, so but if I turn it off,
Turn it off. Just remember.
Nobody in the webcast wants to hear me. Try to talk to you, leave it on. Bob can't keep silent for more than 5 seconds. Just turn it on.
speak.
When you sit.
Okay.
You put in.
Play.
Off, right?
Because somebody's got to moderate the fight, right? And we all agree. As soon as you're out of why are you so... You haven't heard what I'm upset about. Wait till I'm done. You may think I'm mad about it. No, I keep saying think positive. We're your ally.
Is this on? Yeah.
Test. Okay.
What I'm going to do is... Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to make some... What's challenging for this group is to say how education needs segregation. So we start somewhere in there. I'll do Chris's comments. I don't want to do those at the end of mine, and then we'll take questions.
I think we're ready to start. Wow, it's good. It's pretty good. Thank you. We're ready to start the last panel. The challenge of the last panel is you're all worn out. I think probably on a more positive, we're about to talk about, as Dick introduced us before, what can the federal government do for you? So you might want to run the other way. I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then what I'm going to do in my role here, I'd love to copy Amy's coffee talk approach, but it doesn't work that well for me. I'm going to put out some comments, some probably contentious, some controversial. I believe some of them. I don't believe in others. I'm not going to tell you which are which. And then I'm going to ask the panelists to react in their own way to what I put out or what's on the agenda. I think it's a very important discussion, and then we'll take questions. I'm not going to waste much time introducing their biographies, so I'm just going to tell you who they are. On the far left is David Chu, now with Institute for Defense Analysis, formerly with Department of Defense. Mike Nugent, also with Department of Defense. I'm going to call it National Security Education Program because I hate the Defense Language and National Security Education Office. That's good, right? And Clay Pell, who just recently, it's now not recent anymore, is it? It's months. It's months. Joined the Department of Education, but has a background both in government and in academia that certainly makes him appropriate for the conversation we're about to have. Our fourth panelist is Chris Gaston, who's Chief of Staff for Congressman Rush Holt, and he sends his regrets, and believe me, he does regret where he sits right now. But he warned me on Friday that unless something momentous happened between Friday and this morning, that he was going to have to sit there and wait for nothing more to happen. And that's where he is. Kindly, and if any of you know Chris, he's very thorough. He did send me some comments and remarks that I will read to you because I want to be very careful not to add any nuance to what Chris has said. But he diligently sat this afternoon and wrote me some comments. So when I get back to the appropriate time, I will come up and act like Chris. Okay, so I want to put some questions and very quickly, questions and comments out. One of the problems with doing a panel at the end of the day is I really felt like I was organized when I got here this morning. I've rewritten them 11 times, listening to all the other discussion that's taking place. So bear with me. In many ways, the involvement of the federal sector in language is an anomalous model. The ups and downs in federal support are often a byproduct of this model, and I'll talk a little bit about what that model is and a couple of the other questions. Federal funding for language, and I say language as opposed to area studies, but sometimes it's hard not to lump the two together in some of the programs, since the 1950s, has almost all the time arisen as a practical approach to building a primarily federal workforce with the skills needed to support national security. Foreign Service Institute, Defense Language Institute exists because of a lack of supply. So think about those institutions, particularly Defense Language Institute, and think for a second that what an anomaly they are in the U.S. education system, that if we had law schools not producing lawyers who were somehow good enough, and I don't want to go there, the government would invent a Defense Legal Institute. Well, we have, but that's... So imagine the analogous examples here. We have we have two major language bureaucracies in the federal government. We have others as well that have grown because the supply is lacking in the workforce that's hired by the federal government. National Defense Education Act, Title VI, Title VIII, National Security Education Program, Nestle Y, are all programs that were a response to supply concerns and are all programs that responded to a national security imperative, every one of them. And that's an important thing to underscore. There are other programs, but most of the significant programs in the federal government arose from a national security imperative. Next statement, federal support is undependable and unpredictable. Get used to it, it's going to get worse. And it's idiosyncratic. And I say idiosyncratic because more often than not it's tied to the power of individual members. And when I come back to what Chris is going to tell you in his remarks to you, he's going to underscore that. But often federal legislation on language has emerged because a handful of very powerful members have decided this is important. A handful of influential members, usually on Armed Services Committee, usually allied with the Armed Services and Defense folks on the Appropriations Committees and the Intelligence Committees. It's a dangerous process when you look for federal government support because you're linking it to a few personalities. David Obey, one example. For me personally, David Boren. But you link these programs to individuals, you are in a risky business. If national security is the primary rationale for language programs funded by the federal government, what are the consequences of that engagement? And I do want to just put on the table return on investment. One of the things I dealt with, one of the things you deal with on programs that are funded by defense, I'm not saying other agencies don't do this as well, but the expectation of returns, usually immediate. So that has some implications when we start talking about K through 12, as we would love to do that, but we don't have time for 13 years, 15 years, 17 years, 18 years, so there's a question of that. Another contention is lack of leadership on both sides. No single voice for language. We heard that this morning in the United States. Department of Education has largely, historically, been absent in the discussion. Department of Defense has often stepped in to assume responsibility for language programs, but there's no single voice in the executive branch, and now there's no voice in Congress for language programming in the United States. So that needs to be, I'm putting that on the table. Another statement, is there too much concern about preserving the status quo in funding? I want to put that out for discussion. Are we also happy with our rice bowls that we don't want anybody to mess with them? That's my money, don't take it away. I know that may be a priority, but I've been getting that money for 40 years. I want to keep getting that money. And I know you ought to maybe put it there, but if you put it there, my money's gone. And sitting in the meeting this morning, perhaps I shouldn't have been checking my email, but I got an interesting email of a post in the Chronicle of Education from an individual in the Title VI program that was talking about how unhappy she was about program cuts and telling me what a large percentage of their program cuts in Title VI meant how many language programs were now gone and how it had decimated the language field in the United States. If I go back to my days in the federal government, or I'm sitting on the Hill and I ask the question, you got this money for 40 years and you're telling me that it's so unimportant to your institution that 1 year the money's gone, immediately the programs are eliminated. What does that tell me about the partnership between the federal sector and higher education? So that's a real concern, an entitlement mentality and a rice bowl mentality. Next question, what about K through 12? Is there too much spending on higher ed? And let's admittedly say the budget for all of this is so tiny that the debate becomes really odd. Is there too much funding for higher ed? And if we go back to one of Dick's comments early this morning, if we're really concerned about broadening the base, why is the federal money so imbalanced toward higher ed and not toward creating the pipeline? We do have 3 major programs, Star Talk, Nestle Y, small piece of flagship in K through 12. They're all ad hoc. They're all maybe temporary. I hope they're not. But they didn't emerge from any strategic thinking about what we needed in K through 12. And the only program that really was federal sponsoring of K through 12 education was the Foreign Language Assistance Program is gone. So what does that tell you? So you're slicing a very small pie, and I'm not sure you're slicing it the right way. So we come back to the questions, what is the role of the federal government here? And we need to talk about that. Is it incubating new ideas? We heard about some really interesting concepts in the last panel. Basic research, testing, the kinds of things the government can engage with education on, put money in, and then leave at some point and say, we've done our job, we're out of it, we're not going to fund you for the rest of your lives. Tech transfer from public to private. We have examples of that with CASL. We have examples of that with DLI. Is that more? Is that more of what we need? And finally, my last comment before I turn it over is it not time to start rethinking the partnership between the federal sector and education? New ideas, new thinking, new strategies. It gets difficult, particularly in these kinds of environments, to argue that we're on the right path, just keep giving us the money, we promise you we're going to get there. have faith, have confidence. In this kind of environment, maybe we need to start thinking about what can the federal government do to really move us along? What kinds of partnerships can we invent, reinvent? Are we willing to take some of what we've already done and throw it out and start over? Are we willing to engage in that conversation? That's something I put out to everybody to consider as we move ahead. So those are my opening blasts. David?
Okay.
We can stay here now.
I'll sit right here. Well, I want to thank you and Dick for the chance to participate in this panel and offer my prejudices on the subject that you outlined, and the big question you raised, which is what's the role of the federal government? And in my judgment, the single focus of the federal government needs to be leadership. And leadership particularly on what the economists would call, I was trained as an economist originally, the demand side. In other words, where are the positions, where are the needs, particularly at the federal level, that the educational system should serve with its various programs. And I think the federal government has been, in my estimation, much too shy about acknowledging the degree to which, given the success of American foreign policy in the last 60 years, we now have a global economy where we should not assume that everyone is going to be keen on dealing with us in English. It's certainly true of the military. The military today, and it has, as I was discussing with Bob before we started, a different view of language and culture needs than it had 15 years ago. Mid-senior officers, the ones who really control the agenda of the military, acknowledge now in thinking about their future that they ought to have an ability to understand in depth, which they felt they did not have in Iraq and Afghanistan, in depth the societies in which they operate. And that means language and cultural preparation of their personnel. How they're going to get there is a whole other matter. And that's really, I think, the education system's role, not, as you point out, Bob, the federal role to make up for its deficiencies. But we have not, I think, in the federal government, been clear about what those needs are. We've been shy about it. We've been much too closed and inward-looking in the Defense Department, too reliant on the internal institutions to produce the answers to those needs and not willing enough to go out and forge that kind of partnership. I do think there's a standards role for the federal government. I don't mean the sense of core, common core, or which test to use, but speaking to what level do we want linguistic preparation to achieve. And of course, my vote would be for a much higher level than we think of today. Why shouldn't more American federal persons be essentially bilingual, if not trilingual in character? Other nations expect that of their central government persons, either in part or in whole. Why should we lag behind? Now, Condoleezza Rice, when she was Secretary of State, did persuade President George W. Bush to launch a national security language initiative, which was intended, at least for the national security community, to get us there, got shoved off the screen by the furor over STEM. And let's not put STEM down, but that's not the only educational objective out there. And I think, again, the federal government has been too reluctant to step forward and say, this is where American citizens of the future ought to be able to perform. I do think that there is a modest role for the federal government to play in funding innovation, seed money. But I don't think it's practical to look to the federal government to finance most of this. Now, that's not an easy message to offer, but that's as you all appreciate, that's the American structure. Education is a local, really a state phenomenon increasingly. And I think in terms of where the federal government might look to succeed, I would urge taking a page out of what we found in the last decade or so very effective in dealing with military families, and that's to partner with the governors and to work explicitly with the National Governors Association on what the federal government and the governors together can do to change these answers. But the governors are not going to react unless the feds are clear. There's a series of federal responsibilities that require high-end language and cultural skills. And I think that does mean, Bob, given the kind of competency one wants to reach, K through 12 really needs to be the focus, not just an add-on to the program.
I'm going to, since Chris Gaston was, last name begins with a G, I'm going to assume he would have been speaking now. So somewhat reluctantly, I am going to Well, I am. I'm going to read verbatim what Chris sent me, which is really important for you to hear.
Turn on your mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's on now. Sorry I can't be there today, but it is symptomatic of why you are meeting. Why, when we don't know if the government will be open tomorrow, how can any member of Congress, the administration, or you all make long-term plans for improving the language proficiency in America? Not too long ago, Rush and other members, Rush Holt, and other members would talk to your appropriators about items and programs they cared about. Through those conversations, Title VI, FLAP, and NACP were able to remain strong and even grow. But now with flat or worse sequester funding levels, it's no surprise they are mostly all on life support. You might disagree with that with Chris on NACP, but few members of Congress care about languages. And even the historic reason for caring, national security, does not have as much sway. When the Education Committee sought to deauthorize FLAP, Rush argued strongly that it would weaken our security, quoting generals and the CIA director. But we got 0 Republican votes and FLAP got defunded. A lot of this can be traced to the breakdown of appropriations committees and it's our ability to produce bills which make it hard for members to have priorities. The system worked. I'm not going to editorialize here. When 535 members of the Congress had 535 different priorities, some won, some lost, but many got something. Tomorrow, no one will get anything, and long-term big-picture challenges like language will get washed aside. Going forward, we need to restore K through 12 dollars for foreign language, refocus Title VI, and one thing that would help is increasing funding for education across the board to relieve pressure on schools to cut back. We also need the U.S. Department of Education to push harder and to do more on language. If they are not leading, who can we expect to? Deputy Assistant Secretary Pell has a tough but important job. One Rush established in HEA, and he needs more partners. And he needs a unified language community to work with, not a fractured community to fight defensive actions. Some will lose, but if we all keep our own and stay to ourselves, then everyone will lose. The benefits of language learning to cognitive development should be enough reason for people to support more investments, but it's a classic example of Congress and administration not being able to focus on long-term problems. Fortunately, you will solve all of that today. And you will all report to Chris that I read that verbatim. Mike.
So where do I start?
So start after Chris.
Well, let me just say, I passed Bob a note before we came up, and I said, be positive. Because it's so easy in the language world not to be positive. And I want to break the rule, Dick, and I'm going to do this publicly, and say that I'm going to advocate. I know we're not supposed to. But I've got at least 24 colleagues from the Department of Defense here, and there's a reason. Thank you. But they're here for a reason, and these are very busy people. I see them here, they're very senior people here who are very committed to language. And I think that there is a reason for that, and I think it's important when we speak about, because Bob sent out this email saying, could you speak from the perspective of what the best prospects are? And I think from the standpoint of the Department of Defense, you have to ask the question, and this is comparison between education and defense. We sit in different standpoints. We have different missions. Sometimes they overlap, but certainly from the Defense Department, we can't wait around for legislation. We can't wait around for other folks to do stuff for us. And in some cases, we can't wait around for the capabilities to be created by someone else. So slowly but surely, we have gotten involved in teaching languages, not only at our star institutions like the Defense Language Institute Foreign Language Center or at the English Language Center, but also in schools, colleges, and not only focusing on undergraduates, graduate students, but also more increasingly on K-12 students. And so I think it's important to understand why. And we were lucky under the tenure of Dr. Chu. He noticed during his tenure as leadership as undersecretary that there was a lot of diffuse approaches to language at the department. We have a huge array of missions and authorities, And he pulled that together under the Defense Language Program, and that has given us a lot more focus on what we want to do. And one of the main things we noticed was, what are our requirements? What are our needs? We actually couldn't answer that question when he started that, and we are getting daily better at knowing what our requirements are. The second question really is, what are our capabilities? Once we know what our needs are, we then need to know what our capabilities are. And once we know those, we can actually make determinations for recruitment, for training, and retention. And the most important thing there is, we've discovered if we can bring people in to our workplace, and it's a large workplace, with language capabilities and cultural capabilities, having studied languages and cultures in high school or in the universities, our job is much, much easier. So there is a very selfish approach to how we approach this. I mean, we need it. The second thing is really important from what federal government can do. Well, having worked at FIPSE, the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education, and that was my first tenure in government, I've always kept with me that idea that federal government does the best work when it funds innovation. And Dr. Chu spoke about that as well. But the idea of trying to seed fund innovation and then let the field follow has always been the motto of NCEP as well. When Bob set up NCEP, I know he came over to FIPSE and said, how do you guys do things? Well, that was the whole idea. It wasn't to just fund everything. It was to get innovation going. And I can proudly say, after listening to Sam's talk about the flagship program, that slowly but surely the infrastructure that we're building, that infrastructure that we're building throughout the flagship program is now creating the opportunities for other institutions to get on board. And I did see there was a, you call it a tweet, right? On the, my kids